All right, well, hello and welcome to the very last of our Civil War units. This is the effects of the Civil War. So at this point, we've talked about what the country was like before the war. We've talked about the famous figures that are involved in the Civil War. We've talked about the shots fired beginning at Fort Sumter, then hitting Gettysburg, and then we've also talked about the end of the war with the Atlanta campaign, Sherman's march to the sea, and finally Lee's surrender at the Appomattox courthouse. So what we're going to look at is what did the country look like immediately after the war? So the first thing that you need to know is the South is completely in ruins. If you remember back, we talked about how most of the fighting was actually done in the South. And by the end of the war, many of the South's major cities were completely destroyed. This is a good image of the ruins of the Navy Yard in Norfolk, Virginia. So you can see it is just completely devastated, completely destroyed by Union troops as they began to take the tide of the war after Gettysburg. This guy here looks very nonchalant, but I'm sure that whatever he's looking at, especially if he's from the South, he's probably not pretty pleased with. Okay. Here's another example, more destruction in Charleston. This is 1865, right there about the time the war ended. We see buildings completely destroyed. This here looks like it was the entrance to another building, a very large one. This over here looks like it might be the remains of a church. This is just another example. And of course, you know, Atlanta was completely destroyed after the Civil War. And many cities that were on their way to the sea, on their way to Savannah. This is Richmond, Virginia, which, if you remember, was the capital of the Confederate States of America. Richmond is no longer a national capital, and it's hardly a city at all at this point. We see where heavy artillery has taken out large buildings. These buildings have been on fire. You can tell from the scorch marks above the windows, and these men just standing in rubble, completely destroyed. The other big important thing is they didn't just destroy buildings. Remember, the North destroyed railroad lines. Even before the Civil War, there were not enough railroad lines in the South, but it's what they were working on building. Those railroad lines are crucial to take the crops that are grown in the South and be able to transport them to the North for their industrial factories and things like that, but also to get goods back home. This is a really, really great illustration of the railroad depot in Richmond, Virginia after the Civil War. You see right here, this is just a lone locomotive, obviously not attached to any track. The railroad depot is completely destroyed, and this railroad worker clearly out of a job. Without these railroads, the South's ability to rebound after the war is incredibly decreased. It's going to be a lot harder to transport any food, any extra goods, things that are manufactured specifically in the North, like clothing. It is nearly impossible at this point, with the lack of railroads, to get goods to and from the South in a way that is going to support the people still living there. Here's another great look at what has happened to the railroads. We see these men just standing on this broken down railroad line that's clearly not going anywhere. They look like they might be kind of hopeful. But this is also in Richmond, possibly trying to move the remains of these locomotives out of the way. So what about the slaves? If you remember, the slaves in the rebelling states were freed midway through the Civil War. And we see this is from Harper's Weekly in March 30th of 1867. So at this point, this is a little bit after the war. Harper should sound familiar, as in Harper's Ferry. We see that there are now these things called freedmen's schools, and they're schools that are set up for freed slaves. We see one down here in Washington, D.C., and the one on the left existing in Atlanta. Now, obviously, the only people attending these freedmen's schools are black students, which in a couple, or not even a couple centuries, about a century later, that is what we call segregation, and that is what the civil rights movement fought to stop, among many other forms of discrimination. But this is the first some of the first freedmen's schools that you see for all black students, for freed slaves. which before they had no schools. So at this point, it's looking like it's a great thing. They're going to educate these slaves so that they can become a part of society, but unfortunately, that integration in society doesn't happen for over a century at this point. The Freedmen's Bureau was also created to keep peace between the free blacks and the whites. Obviously, the white slave owners are not pleased that all of their slaves have been freed. These slave owners are saying, you know, we paid for these slaves are our property, and our property has been taken, while these freed black Americans are now trying to find some sort of independence in a world where they've never been able to own any land, or really do anything without the permission or assistance of a slave owner. So the Freedmen's Bureau was created to try and keep the peace between these two groups of people who were definitely not on good terms. Meanwhile, in the North was rebounding quickly. Something that's interesting, you don't have to know it for a test or anything, but when railroads were created at this time, a lot of times the width of the railroad tracks was not the same. So you would have maybe a railroad that ran from New York to Virginia, and the railroad lines were a certain width, but then anything that took off from Virginia to, say, Tennessee, they might have had a different width for their railroad tracks. So they weren't standardized. It required different railroads to be built, which cost more money. And it made it more difficult to get from place to place, because if the railroads that were connected weren't the same width, then they had to change the locomotives, and it cost a lot of money and took a lot of time. Well, the North, about midway through the Civil War, was beginning to standardize their railroad lines. So they were coming up with a width that was standard that they were going to use for all of the railroads in the North. It made it a lot easier to transport things because they weren't having to constantly change the locomotives on and off the track, or they weren't having to add so many stops because the other railroads were from a different width. So an interesting fact is that the North was actually standardizing the width of the railroad lines, which was making it easier for their railroads to be more efficient, while they were also destroying the railroads that were in the South. So the North has railroads, which means they can transport goods, they can still trade things, they can get people and information from place to place at a much faster pace than the South was able to. Also, industry was still huge in the North. Because they didn't rely so much on slave labor, the elimination of slave labor didn't really affect the Northern economy. This is a good example of what a New England factory looked like. Notice what's right in front of it? A railroad. That's because they would manufacture the goods, put them on the railroad, and take them where they needed to be in the North. Because the North focused so much on industry, their economy was not as heavily affected. Because the fighting didn't take place in the North, their towns weren't destroyed, their factories weren't as destroyed, which meant that their economy was not very affected. Life in the North was not heavily affected by the Civil War, especially if you compare it to the destruction in the South. The South's economy and life in the South completely changed after the Civil War. Okay? In summary, the Civil War badly hurt the South. The agricultural farming economy collapsed with the loss of slave labor, and the destruction of railroads slowed its ability to rebuild. Meanwhile, in the North, the economy rebounded quickly as factories continued to produce and sell goods, and the standardization of railroad track sizes made transporting their goods easier. We see two very different places after the Civil War. We see a South that is completely crippled and wondering how in the world it's going to find its footing again, and a North that is now significantly stronger than the southern part of the country. So, beginning in our next unit, we're going to talk about something called Reconstruction. They had to reconstruct the South, and that had some good aspects and some bad aspects. But for right now, this is the end of the Civil War unit. Please, please, please go back through before your test, before any major daily grades, and look through all of these things that you've learned already. I also want you to go back to the home page. There's a bunch of Quizlets listed there to help you practice things like important people, important battles, and important vocabulary terms. And that's going to be it for me today. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and I will see you historians tomorrow.